What's missing from the map, entirely missing, is Antarctica. There's just a hole at the bottom of the world. There's nothing there. The reason that Antarctica is not there is that our civilization hadn't discovered Antarctica in 1818. So they couldn't authentically put it on a map in 1818. Actually, we discovered it in 1819, and that's when it starts appearing on modern maps. The problem is that Antarctica appears repeatedly on these much older maps, and it appears in the right place and a bit bigger than it is today, but very much as it looked during the last ice age. So what all of this suggests to me is that the world was mapped and explored by a global seafaring culture with a level of technology that was at least equivalent to ours at the end of the 18th century during the ice age.
When archaeologists talk about seafaring humans, what do they date that to?
The great seafaring adventure that is accepted by archaeology is called the Polynesian expansion. And it's a remarkable story. And that occurs roughly 3,000 to 3,500 years ago. And those Polynesians were amazing ocean navigators. They could cross distances of thousands of kilometers with pinpoint accuracy. I mean, it's not an accident that the Polynesians found Easter Island. Finding Easter Island is a really challenging project. Easter Island is 2,000 miles from the coast of South America. It's 2,000 miles from the nearest other island, which is Tahiti. It's just a little speck in the middle of the ocean, but the Polynesians found it and settled there and appear to have brought a reproductively viable population there and appear to have made voyages back and forth. But that was 3,000 to 3,500 years ago. That was not 12,800 years ago. And this is where archaeology's adamant position that ocean voyaging was begun by the Polynesians and that there was no major ocean voyages before that, I think needs to be strongly questioned, and it needs to be strongly questioned in the light of this DNA evidence from the Amazon rather than rejecting the evidence. An attempt should be made to consider what that might mean.
Well, it's interesting because we know that the Egyptians had boats.
Yeah.
And so, if there were boats 4,500 years ago, why do we think that they didn't try them out in the ocean? That doesn't make any sense, especially if they existed 1,000 years prior, which is also possible.
Archaeologists wouldn't argue that the Egyptians had boats, but that is still within the framework of accepted history. It's the notion of a global navigating culture in the Ice Age that archaeologists can't swallow. It's a subject that I've kept on coming up against over a number of years. I think the best evidence for it is ancient maps, which show the world as it looked during the last ice age. We're talking about maps that were drawn roughly between the 1300s and the 1700s. In other words, in relatively recent history. However, these maps were largely based on much older source maps, which they copied. And we can say that for sure, because one of the famous maps is the Piri Reis map, which was created by a Turkish admiral called Piri Reis in the year 1513. Actually, only a corner of his map has survived. It was originally a world map. We now just have a bit that shows the east coast of South America and North America and the west coast of Africa. Piri Reis writes in that map that it is in his own handwriting that he based it on more than 100 older source maps, some of which had come from the Library of Alexandria. In other words, that maps had been, when the Library of Alexandria had been destroyed in the 4th century AD or whenever it was, some of its contents had been rescued and brought to Constantinople, which became the Turkish capital, and Piri Reis had access to those maps, and he incorporated information from those maps on his maps, as well as incorporating more recent navigational information. And this is one of a whole category of maps which are extremely hard to explain. All of them based on older source maps now lost. All of them incorporating extremely precise relative longitudes and latitudes. Latitude is not that difficult a technological feat, but longitude is a difficult technological feat. Longitude involves a chronometer. It involves knowing the time at the place you began your voyage and the local noon as well, and calculating the difference between them. You need a chronometer that will keep accurate time at sea with the motions of a ship. And it's just a plain fact that our civilization did not invent such a chronometer until the late 18th century. Before that, we didn't know what longitude we were at, and ships were constantly sailing unexpectedly into coastlines that they thought were hundreds of miles further away. So the discovery of the technique to do longitude was a major civilizational advance. Its presence in maps based on much older source maps that actually show the world as it looks during the last ice age, suggests that somebody during the last ice age was mapping the world and had mastered the technique of calculating longitude. Classic example of these maps, and I make a point of this, is what's called the Pinkerton World Map, which was drawn in the year 1818, and it was based on the latest navigational information at that time. I reproduced that map in the book.
Wasn't there also a map of Greenland that showed it underneath the ice?
Yes, there are. And another intriguing thing, I mentioned the Piri-Reis map just now. Shown on the Piri-Reis map, lying off the east coast of North America, is a large island with a row of megaliths, like a road of megaliths, running up the middle of it. That island is in the exact place of the Grand Bahama Banks. So this island is sitting there off the southeast coast of North America.
Look at the way they used to draw things back then, too.
And what you see running down the middle of it is this road-like feature of megaliths. I'll point them out again.
I see, right there, yeah.
These here. These here. Now, the thing is, there was a long period of my life when I did a lot of scuba diving, and I was looking at underwater structures. And one of the sites I dived on was the Bimini Road, which is in the Grand Bahama Banks. And the Bimini Road is exactly where that island is. And here's the issue. I don't care whether the Bimini Road is natural or man-made. For me, the mystery is that it is shown above water on that map. And the last time it was above water was thousands and thousands of years ago. So for me, this is all evidence that we shouldn't dismiss the possibility that our ancestors had achieved a level of technology where they could explore and map the world's oceans. We shouldn't dismiss that. And the whole effort of archaeology has been to dismiss the significance of the Bimini Road.
How would they dismiss that?
Well, they say
they
say it's totally natural. I can tell you, I absolutely do not think it's natural. I think it's a man-made structure, but the argument is that it's a kind of beach rock that forms in these blocky formations.
Does it? Is that
yes,
right?
beach rock does form in blocky formations, but here I believe that the beach rock has been used as a construction material. But I repeat, the key issue is not whether the Bimini Road is man-made or not. The key issue is that it features on a map above water. And that is a dating project. That tells us that somebody was mapping that bit of the world when it was above water. And
Jamie,
that
go back to that
takes us back a long way into the past.
We have been taught that civilization is entirely an invention of the old world. That view is very firmly embedded in our own cultural arrogance living in the old world. There's a very good book actually called History Begins at Sumer by Samuel Noah Kramer, which attributes the whole origins of civilization to Mesopotamia and the Sumerian civilization, and says that it all began here between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Certainly, nobody was, until very recently, has been open to consider the Americas as a place where civilization might have begun. And that goes partly back to the long-held view of geneticists, now challenged by the new evidence from the Amazon, that there was a single common and relatively recent origin for Native Americans, and that they came across the Bering Straits when the Bering Straits were a land bridge. That explanation no longer holds because of that Australasian DNA in the Amazon. This is the idea, but it just doesn't make sense anymore now that we don't have a DNA trail in North and Central America. And here's something else. This is New Scientist from the 26th of March 2013, Migration Mystery. Who were the first Americans? I'll just read a little bit of it. Not so long ago, there was a simple and seemingly incontrovertible answer to the question of how and when the first settlers made it to the Americas. Some 13,000 years ago, a group of people from Asia walked across a land bridge that connected Siberia to Alaska and headed south. And those people have been named by archaeologists the Clovis culture. We do not know what they called themselves, but this is the name that archaeology has given to these people. And they made these very distinctive Clovis points with fluting in them, both arrowheads and spearheads. The Clovis first paradigm that humans had first entered the Americas around 13,400 years ago, that the Clovis culture was the first Native American culture, became a kind of dogma in archaeology. And that's one of the reasons why I disregard archaeology as a science because there's no room for dogma in science. Archaeologists who defied that dogma, see, in archaeology, the stuff nearer the surface of the earth is the most recent, and the deeper down you go, the older it gets. That's why we say Upper Paleolithic for the recent part of the Stone Age and Lower Paleolithic for the oldest part of the Stone Age. In this case, the dogma was, and it held for more than 50 years, that there was no point in any archaeologist digging below the Clovis level because archaeology had established that there were no human beings in the Americas before Clovis. And in fact, archaeologists who challenged that doctrine, like Jacques Cinq-Mars, who excavated Bluefish Caves in the Yukon and found evidence of humans there 24,000 years ago, those archaeologists had their careers ruined. I'm not speaking figuratively, they were literally ruined. Their research funding was withdrawn, they were mocked and humiliated at conferences, they were just shut up by the archaeological community. And as the Smithsonian has recently admitted, rather than launching a major new search for more early evidence, the finds steered fierce opposition and a bitter debate, quote, one of the most acrimonious and unfruitful in all science, according to Nature. For Jacques Cinq-Mars, it was a brutal experience. It effectively ruined his career and ruined his life, but he was right. Human beings were at Bluefish Caves in the Yukon 24,000 years ago, and a detailed restudy of the site in 2017 has confirmed that. And today, as the Smithsonian admits, decades later, the Clovis first model has collapsed. And it continues to collapse because the dates keep on getting pushed back beyond 24,000 years ago, back in the case of Topper in South Carolina to more than 50,000 years ago. I went and met Al Goodyear, the archaeologist who dared to dig deeper than Clovis, and who, just like Jacques Cinq-Mars, suffered terrible damage to his name and his reputation and his career from the hyena-like attacks of other archaeologists. But again, he was right. He took me to Topper. There's the Clovis level, and Al just had an instinct, really. He felt, I'm actually not going to stop digging once I've reached Clovis. It's a very big Clovis site. I'm going to carry on digging. I'm going to go deeper. And he went deeper, and lo and behold, he found evidence of humans present at Topper 50,000 years ago. And then we have this in Nature in April 2017, the Cerruti Mastodon site, excavated by the chief paleontologist at the San Diego Natural History Museum, Tom Demaray, a site that shows evidence of human presence 130,000 years ago. That's more than 115,000 years earlier than Clovis. And I went and met Tom Demaray at the San Diego Natural History Museum. And like anybody else who's suggested an earlier date for the peopling of the Americas, he has suffered the most unpleasant and vicious attacks, mainly from archaeologists. Because he's threatening them. They have somehow missed this, that human beings were in the Americas for more than 100,000 years before they said. And Tom Demaray's evidence is compelling. The attacks on him will continue, but he spent a day with me. He showed me that evidence in great detail. Again, I set it out at length in the book, and I'm convinced he's absolutely right. He's not documenting the presence of an advanced civilization in North America 130,000 years ago. This is typical Upper Paleolithic behavior. This is a group of humans who scavenged a mastodon skeleton, who scavenged the corpse of a mastodon, and they broke open the bones and they extracted the marrow and left evidence of their presence there. What is important about that finding is that it raises a big question mark over our entire notion of the prehistory of the world. Because if the Americas have been inhabited by humans for 130,000 years, more than twice as long as Europe and 10 times as long as previously supposed, then everything changes. Suddenly we have a vast, resource-rich landmass with 130,000 years of human prehistory, of which only the last 13,000 years have been documented because of the archaeological dogma that there was no point in looking deeper. Goodness knows what was happening here in that time, that so far just nobody has cared to look for. It could have been the location of hitherto unrecognized advances and developments in the story of civilization. One of the reasons that archaeologists have missed it has to do less with dogma and more to do with a global cataclysm that occurred between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. And that global cataclysm is referred to in geology as the Younger Dryas. It's a very peculiar climate episode that unfolded between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. This site, Murray Springs, is one of the last Clovis sites, and what we see here is a mammoth being excavated, and in the shoulder blade of that mammoth was found a Clovis point, dated to 12,800 years ago. But that was exactly the time that the Clovis culture disappeared, and it was exactly the time that the mammoths and the mastodons and the megafauna all became extinct, and we now begin to understand why, and it's to do with this peculiar line that you see in this exposed wash here. This peculiar line that's referred to as the black mat, which was draped like shrink wrap over the top of the remains of Eloise. And at the base of the black mat are some very distinctive chemical and mineral signatures, which include iridium and nanodiamonds. Here, a closer look at the black mat. Iridium, nanodiamonds, platinum, melt glass, carbon spherules. Those nanodiamonds are created by the shock and heat of a cosmic impact. When you find all of these impact proxies together in one place, in abundance, it's really hard to explain them any other way than a cosmic impact. As a result of this, a group of more than 60 scientists since 1207 have been advocating what is still a very controversial hypothesis, and that is called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And they are suggesting that this black mat and the impact proxies within it bear witness to the impact on the North American ice cap of several large fragments of a disintegrating comet. Let me just take you to the dinosaurs for a moment, because we do know now that the dinosaurs became extinct as a result of a cosmic impact. Nobody disputes that. Indeed, the KT event, or the KPG event as it's now known, is marked by a layer in the soil exactly like the Younger Dryas black mat. And it contains exactly the same impact proxies at the base of the layer. And Lewis and Walter Alvarez, the father-son team who originally made this discovery, were quite satisfied with the impact proxies, which are found all over the world. They couldn't explain them in any other way except a cosmic impact, but their colleagues didn't like it, and they were turned upon, and they suffered 10 years of bruising attacks before they found the crater deeply buried beneath the Gulf of Mexico, the Chicxulub crater. And now it's fully accepted that it was a cosmic impact that made the dinosaurs extinct. So I'm showing you a picture of dinosaurs and a chicken here. And that's because these are world-changing events. So world-changing that they almost literally turned dinosaurs into chickens, because the birds are all that's left of the Dinosauria clade. Skulking around in the primeval forests 65 or 66 million years ago was this little shrew-like creature, one of the early mammals. And the mammals were going absolutely nowhere in a world ruled by the dinosaurs. But when the cosmos swept the dinosaurs out of the way, or turned them into chickens, the mammals were able to evolve very rapidly and to occupy niches that had previously been closed off to them, which is why we can now say today, meet your 65 million year old mother. We are all the descendants of that curious shrew-like creature, and we would not be here, the human race would not be here, if it were not for that cosmic impact 65 or 66 million years ago. NASA tells us that such world-changing events only occur once every 100 million years ago. And I have to say, how nice of the universe to be so Germanic in its timekeeping that we can actually set our clocks by it. And if NASA's right in this anodyne explanation, then we today have nothing to worry about, because the last impact was 65 million years ago, and we can't expect another one for 35 million years. Why should we care? But a number of scientists, the late Sir Fred Hoyle, Chandra Wickrem Singh, Victor Klube, Bill Napier, astronomers feel very differently. I'll come on to their work in a moment. This is a NASA fact sheet, and it's explaining what meteor showers are. We've all seen meteors. I'm sure everybody's heard of the Perseids, the Orionids, the Leonids, the Taurids. Every meteor stream is, in fact, the remnant of a disintegrated comet. Every single one of them. When we see those meteors, we're seeing bits of what was formerly a large comet that has broken up into multiple fragments, often dust size, which come through into our atmosphere and burn up. And NASA says, look, don't worry, because they're usually very small, from dust particle to boulder size. And it's a curious thing that there isn't a single ancient culture in the world in which the appearance of a comet in the sky was regarded as good news. It was always regarded as bad news. Why would that be? Well, Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9, which hit Jupiter in 1994, was certainly bad news for Jupiter. Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 broke up into 21 fragments. Comets do this because they are lumps of rocky and sometimes iron material bound together with ice. And when they enter the inner solar system, that ice begins to melt and they break up into multiple fragments. That's what happened to Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9. Those 21 fragments bombarded the surface of Jupiter, leaving scars, in some cases larger than the Earth itself. The total explosive power is estimated at 300 gigatons. If you were to take the entire nuclear arsenal of the world today and blow it all up at once, it would yield 6.4 gigatons. These are truly massive events, and this is the moment where I always like to say, thank you, Jupiter, for taking one for the team. Because Jupiter is the guardian of our planet, and it does sweep up most of the comets that come through. But very occasionally, a big comet gets through into the inner solar system. And it looks like that happened. This is the basis of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. It looked like that happened with the extinction of the megafauna between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. An extinction that was global, but that was very heavily focused, centered upon the Americas. Here is Bill Napier. He's the professor of astrobiology at Cardiff University. This is a paper he published in the monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society in July 2010, and it's called Paleolithic Extinctions and the Taurid Complex. His argument, massively reinforced since then, is that the Taurid meteor stream, through which the Earth still passes twice a year, is the remnant of a former giant comet that entered the inner solar system from the Oort cloud or the Kuiper belt deep space about 20,000 years ago, a comet that may have been as much as 100 miles in diameter. And as it entered the inner solar system on an Earth-crossing orbit, it began to break up, as comets do, and its debris stream began to widen and extend all the way along its orbit. And then 12,800 years ago, some of the big fragments in the Taurid meteor stream hit the Earth and caused the Younger Dryas cataclysm and the extinction of the megafauna. This is what the Taurid meteor stream looks like diagrammatically. It's this huge tube of debris. We know that there are still large objects in it. The most famous of them is called Comet Encke. And Comet Encke is about 5 kilometers in diameter. And Comet Encke is a fragment of that original giant comet. Likewise, Comet Olgiato, Comet Rudnicki, and 19 of the brightest near-Earth objects are in the Taurid meteor stream. And the Earth's orbit passes through the orbit of the Taurid meteor stream twice a year, in June and in November. And I liken it rather to strapping on a blindfold and crossing an 8-lane motorway and just hoping that we don't meet any traffic. Or if we do, that it would be a motorcycle rather than a truck. It's called the Taurid meteor stream because it appears to emanate in the region of the sky occupied by the constellation of Taurus. Of course, it's not coming from Taurus. It's within our solar system, but that's the radiant of the Taurid meteor stream. We passed through it in June, we passed through it in November, and the last object, many astronomers are agreed on this, that fell out of the Taurid meteor stream caused an event known as the Tunguska event, and that happened in June 1908. And it wasn't even a really big bit of the Taurid meteor stream. It's calculated to have measured between 60 and 190 meters in diameter. And it didn't even hit the Earth on the 30th of June, 1908. What it did was it blew up in the sky. It was an airburst. Fortunately, happened over an uninhabited area of Siberia. It killed nobody, but it flattened 80 million trees across an area of more than 2,000 square kilometers. That is an area larger than London. Had that happened over London, the whole of London, as far as the M25, would have been utterly devastated, and we might be paying more attention to the Taurid meteor stream than we presently are. So the astronomers have been looking at the sky, and meanwhile the geologists behind the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis have been looking at the ground. And here are some of the 60 scientists in what they now call themselves the Comet Research Group. James Kennett, he's a marine geologist, professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Alan West is a geophysicist. Richard Firestone, staff scientist, Nuclear Science Division, Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory. James Whitker is a geologist. Albert Goodyear is, indeed, we met him at Topper, is a professor at the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology. Altogether, there's more than 60 of them. They're all mainstream scientists, every single one of them. They publish their work in mainstream peer-reviewed journals. And they were initially drawn to it by a mystery. And that mystery concerns the ending of the last ice age. The last glacial maximum, 21,300 years ago, sea levels were 400 feet lower than they are today. There was no Red Sea, there was no Persian Gulf. Southeast Asia was vastly extended. New Guinea was joined to Australia. That's because all that extra water was frozen up on these ice caps on top of the northern continents, and indeed into the south as well. And then suddenly, 12,800 years ago, this is the mystery they were drawn to study, the episode called the Younger Dryas begins, and it begins with a collapse of global temperatures, a sudden deep freeze after the world has been warming up for thousands of years. And that deep freeze lasts for 1,200 years, and then 11,600 years ago, temperatures rocket up again. And during this period is precisely the period of the megafaunal extinctions, and it's after 11,600 years ago, after the end of the Younger Dryas, that the whole story of human civilization as it's taught to us supposedly unfolds. I don't expect you to read these papers. I simply want to make the point that the scientists of the Comet Research Group are mainstream figures, and they are publishing in peer-reviewed journals. This is the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It's their very first paper. Since then, they've revised the date to closer to 12,800 years ago, but the title speaks for itself: Evidence for an Extraterrestrial Impact 12,900 years ago that contributed to the megafaunal extinctions and the Younger Dryas cooling. Paper from 2009, Shock Synthesized Hexagonal Diamonds in Younger Dryas Boundary Settlements. Lonsdaleite is known on Earth only in meteorites and impact craters, and its presence strongly supports a cosmic impact event. Here's evidence of high temperature impacts and melt products. Here's evidence from Mexico, evidence from the Greenland ice cores, which are an incredible resource for studying ancient climate, because ice has remained on Greenland where it didn't remain on Northern Europe and North America. Evidence for the deposition of 10 million tons of impact spherules across 4 continents 12,800 years ago. Journal of Geology, 2014, nanodiamond-rich layer across 3 continents, consistent with major cosmic impact at 12,800 calendar years before the present. This is the Younger Dryas boundary field as it was understood in July 2015. The epicenter is clearly North America, but it extends into Greenland and it extends across into Europe. Evidence of those impacts in Europe, and the furthest east at that time was Syria. But the research continues. I mentioned the large platinum anomaly in the Greenland ice cores. Chris Moore of the University of South Carolina did a detailed study of sites across North America, and he found that same platinum anomaly documented at the Younger Dryas onset in North American sedimentary sequences. And this is a paper published in Nature Scientific Reports in March 2017. 2018, Journal of Geology, extraordinary biomass burning episode and impact winter triggered by the Younger Dryas cosmic impact 12,800 years ago. And another paper in the Journal of Geology, also 2018, did the black mat impact airburst reach the Antarctic? Because they have found evidence of those same impact proxies as far south as the Antarctic. It looks like the Younger Dryas boundary field is going to have to be greatly extended. And the most recent paper, 13th of March 2019, again in Nature Scientific Reports, sedimentary record from Patagonia, southern Chile, reports cosmic impact triggering of biomass burning, climate change, and megafaunal extinctions 12,800 years ago. The epicenter was around here, between North America and Greenland, and there is evidence for cataclysmic flooding across North America, dated to the Younger Dryas, between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. Here's a map that shows the extensive scarring of what are called the channeled scablands in the Pacific Northwest of North America. I just state in passing that if any civilization had happened to be based in this area before the flooding, not a bit of it would be left for us to find today, because this was truly epic scale. This is a meteorite, it's an iron meteorite, and it was found in Oregon, and it's sacred to the Native American people of Oregon. But it didn't come from Oregon. It came from 100 miles further north. It came from the Canadian ice cap, and it was carried in an iceberg on those floods from Canada into Oregon. And then the iceberg melted away, leaving this 15-ton oriented iron meteorite, and dated to exactly 12,800 years ago. Also dated to that period is this huge so-called glacial erratic, 500 feet above the valley floor at Wenatchee in the Pacific Northwest. It's a really big thing. I'm standing on top of it here for scale. It's calculated to weigh 18,000 tons. It came from Canada, like that iron meteorite. How did it get to the Pacific Northwest of the United States, a journey of more than 100 miles? It got there in an iceberg the size of an oil tanker. Ice caps enchain and snatch up huge rocks and lock them in place. And when that ice cap melts, the icebergs are released carrying these rocks. And in this case, that flood that carried that iceberg must have been at least 500 feet deep above the valley floor. It grounded on the valley side. The flood waters receded quite rapidly, and the iceberg was left in place, melted away, and revealed this huge rock enchained within it. And it's not alone. Rocks on this giant scale, carried there in enormous icebergs, are found all over the Pacific Northwest. And this area is even called Boulder Park. There's so many of them. And we must try to envisage the kind of floods that could have caused this level of damage. Floods that were jostling with enormous icebergs that had whole forests ripped up by their roots within them, that were mud and rubble in the basis of them, highly erosive features. Erosive enough to create this fossilized waterfall called Dry Falls in just 2 weeks. The water at the bottom of Dry Falls is just rainwater that has pooled there. But 12,800 years ago, a humongous flood poured over this and scoured out that waterfall and then stopped quite suddenly. To get a sense of the scale, if we put Niagara Falls in the picture, you can begin to realize how big Dry Falls is. Niagara Falls is still there. The river is still creating it. Dry Falls, 12,800 years ago, the work of 2 weeks of flooding. Nature is fractal. We know that what nature does on a small scale, it also does on a large scale. So go to the beach, watch the tide go out, and you will see little current ripples on the beach. And those ripples might be an inch high and a few feet long. But there are current ripples on the Camas Prairie in the Pacific Northwest that are on a completely different scale. You can get a sense of it here. We'll go closer. That's a car for scale. These current ripples are 50 feet high and 300 feet long. And they testify to the most enormous flooding that passed through and then receded in that area. And the story continues in Minnesota. It continues in the Finger Lakes of New York State. The latest science is saying these are not carved by glaciers. These are the result of flooding. There's evidence of huge impacts in the northeast of North America. The craters are beginning to emerge, again dated to 12,800 years ago, like the Corisol crater. And just recently, I'm sure many of you saw these headlines about a crater discovered in Greenland, a crater that's 19 miles wide, and that appears to be the result of a mile-wide iron meteorite just 12,000 years ago. I would be irresponsible to tell you that that crater is 12,800 years old. The science hasn't been done yet. What we know is that underneath it is massively disturbed Pleistocene ice, Ice Age ice. And what's above it is completely clean and undisturbed Holocene ice from our own period. More work needs to be done to confirm that it is a 12,800-year-old site. I think it's going to turn out to be that, but I will not claim that until the science has been done. Interestingly enough, the site of that crater in Greenland, you can see how closely connected it all is to North America, the epicenter of the global cataclysm that caused the Younger Dryas. And gradually, although they've been very controversial, although they've faced a lot of opposition, the work of the Comet Research Group and their Younger Dryas impact hypothesis are being taken up by more and more scientists. And the summary is that 12,800 years ago, multiple fragments of a giant comet impact the Earth. At least 4 of them were in the range of 2 kilometers in diameter, with the impacts concentrated on the North American ice cap and the contiguous Greenland ice cap. One question is, why did the world get so cold at the beginning of the Younger Dryas? The answer is because of all that meltwater that the shock and heat of the impacts flushed off the ice cap and into the Atlantic Ocean, where it stopped the Gulf Stream dead in its tracks. And the Gulf Stream is part of the global central heating system of our planet. That whole thermohaline circulation, overturning circulation, stopped for 1,200 years, and that's why the world got so cold. The bigger mystery almost is why it got so warm 11,600 years ago. And as early as the 1980s, Sir Fred Hoyle, who was then professor of astronomy at Cambridge University, was proposing that the event of 11,600 years ago was also caused by comet impacts. And it would be fragments of the same comet that caused the disaster 12,800 years ago, and fragments of which are still in circulation in the torrid meteor stream. In that case, 11,600 years ago, the impacts were on an ocean, not on an ice cap. The effect was gigantic tidal waves, an enormous amount of water vapor thrown into the upper atmosphere, a greenhouse effect, and the sudden warming that we see 11,600 years ago. Science at the beginning of the Younger Dryas is much better than the science at the end, but whatever the agency, one thing's sure. The Younger Dryas did end abruptly 11,600 years ago. Global temperatures soared, and the remaining ice caps very rapidly collapsed into the sea, causing a dramatic pulse of sea level rise, nominated by geologists as Meltwater Pulse 1b. Let me add that there was also a dramatic pulse of sea level rise at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, 12,800 years ago. And that is very puzzling, because that is a period of freezing, and normally you would expect the water to stay on the ice cap. We need to look for an agency that could have released water at the same time as turning the world cold, and a comet fits the bill perfectly. We have Meltwater Pulse 1b at the end of the Younger Dryas, and this is the point where I need to ask, was Turtle Island, and that's the name that Native Americans give to North America, could Turtle Island have been the fabled and much scoffed at lost continent, lost civilization of Atlantis? Because that date, 11,600 years ago, 9,600 BC, is precisely the date that Plato gives us for the destruction and flooding of Atlantis. And I can show you how he gives it to us. Plato appears to have got the story through his ancestral line, through the Greek lawmaker Solon, who visited Egypt in 600 BC, and was there told by the priests the story of Atlantis and how it had been destroyed by flooding. And when Solon asked the priests, when did this happen? When was Atlantis swallowed up by the sea? When did it vanish? And they answered rather matter-of-factly, 9,000 years ago. That was in 600 BC. That's 9,600 BC. That's 11,600 years ago. That is Meltwater Pulse 1b. If Plato made the whole story up, as archaeologists claim, he was astonishingly on the money with the latest scientific evidence about the end of the last ice age. Plato tells us that Atlantis had advanced architecture, advanced agriculture, advanced navigational, shipbuilding, and seagoing skills, advanced social and political organization. We learn from him that it was formerly a beautiful, generous culture, dedicated to the nature of spirit. But he reports that Atlantis became arrogant. It became cruel and conceited. it ceased to carry its prosperity with moderation. It began to impose its will and its power on other less technically able cultures around the world. It developed a bad case of what the Greeks call hubris, and the universe punished it with nemesis. The universe slapped Atlantis down, and this happened in a single dreadful day and night. And what the Timaeus and Critias dialogues of Plato tell us is that those who survived it were the meek of the earth, the herdsmen, the shepherds, the hunter-gatherers. They were the ones who survived, not primarily the citizens of Atlantis, but the people who they had been imposing their will upon. Those people did not have letters, and thus it leaves only those of you who are destitute of letters and education. And so you have to begin all over again, like children, and know nothing of what happened in ancient times. So I think the very real possibility that's emerging from the work of the Comet Research Group, documenting a massive global cataclysm involving flooding between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, requires us to reconsider the whole story of Atlantis, the whole worldwide tradition of a lost civilization of remote prehistory. Maybe it wasn't just Clovis and the megafauna that were swept away and destroyed in that cataclysm. Maybe we've lost a whole episode of the human story at that time, and we will not recover it. We cannot recover it if we have a dogma that tells us that there were no human beings in America before 13,400 years ago. Unfortunately, that dogma is now being overcome. Very near the end of the talk now, but I just want to say that if there's doubt about the origins of civilization, there's also doubt about its future, and that this figure of 100 million year intervals between extinction level events is complacent and irresponsible. Actually, we're surrounded by a cat's cradle of Earth-crossing objects. NASA tells us that not a single one of those that it has identified is going to hit the Earth in the next 100 years, and that's very reassuring. But the problem is the ones they haven't identified. And we keep seeing new ones that whiz by between the Earth and the Moon, that NASA didn't even know they were there until they pass us by. And their numbers are estimated to exceed 100,000 potentially hazardous asteroids still awaiting discovery. Scientists are waking up to this, and we seem to be getting wake-up calls from the universe. I won't read these headlines, but they all concern near misses from asteroids. 2013, 2014, 2015, 16, 17, 2017 again, more in 2018, right the way through to 2019. This paper was published in March the 25th, 2019. It documents an airburst over the Bering Straits that took place in December 2018, but wasn't noticed at the time because nobody was up there. It was caught on NASA cameras, and we now know that that took place on December the 18th, 2018. 2 days after the publication of this paper, we learn of a giant asteroid just skimming past the Earth on its closest ever approach. But it is the asteroids circulating within the Taurid meteor stream, the fragmented debris of that giant comet, that are regarded as the greatest collision hazard facing the Earth at the present time. The astronomers and mathematicians working on this calculate that between 1 and 200 asteroids of more than a kilometer in diameter orbit within the Taurid meteor stream. Impacts with any one of those would change the story of our civilization completely. And it doesn't have to be gloom and doom. This is not something that we just have to throw up our hands and say we can't do anything about this, because we are a highly technological civilization. And if we want to do something about this, we can. What it takes is the will. What we seem to want to do is to invest trillions of dollars and pounds in creating ever more ghastly and sophisticated ways to murder one another on a giant scale, weapons of mass destruction. No problem with budgets for that, none whatsoever. But budgets to preserve the Earth from the risk of a cosmic impact and from many other environmental risks that the world faces, it's very hard to raise money for those budgets. But the choice is there. Commercial interests are already looking at mining asteroids. If you can mine an asteroid, you can move it, and maybe money shouldn't be the only motive. Maybe preserving this beautiful garden of a planet for our children and our children's children maybe we should realize that that's a much more important thing to do. The choice is ours. It does not have to happen again. If you live in one of the great technological cities of the modern world, you almost never see the stars. Light pollution cuts out the sky, severs our connection with the universe. But if you look down from a NASA satellite, you can see here, for example, Northern Europe, lit up like a golden string of jewels. But down here is the Sahara Desert, inhabited by hunter-gatherers. It's completely dark because there's no electricity there. And the Namibian Desert, again inhabited by hunter-gatherers, completely dark because there's no electricity there. This is often taken as a symbol of the technical advancement of the industrialized societies. But let's think about that a little bit. Go west, and there's North America, lit up like a string of jewels. But there's the Amazon jungle, completely dark because there's so little electricity there. And actually, in the state of Acre, in the southwestern Amazon, where those geoglyphs have recently been found due to clearances, there are still tribes who remain uncontacted by our civilization. They don't even know we exist. Goodness knows what they think when they see a helicopter circling overhead, taking photographs of them. They never knew about our culture before, and suddenly there's these strange beings in flying machines overhead. But we have to ask ourselves, who would survive if something like the Younger Dryas cataclysm were to happen again in our day? If those cosmic impacts were to strike the 21st century world, who would survive it? I do not believe that it would be the inhabitants of the advanced industrialized civilizations. We are the spoilt children of the earth. We are used to having everything at our fingertips. The supermarket shelves stuffed to overflowing with food, roofs over our heads, clothes on our backs. We can go anywhere in the world we like. We consider ourselves to be the masters of the universe. But you stop that food supply into the cities, and it's a just-in-time food supply right now. There's only 2 or 3 days food supply in any city. You stop that food supply into the cities, and I would suggest within a matter of weeks, our much-vaunted civilization would begin to fall apart. The psychological trauma would be massive. People would not be prepared for it in any way, and very few of us, there are exceptions, but very few of us know anything about survival at all, because we depend entirely on a complex interrelated network of skills. Who would survive would be the hunter-gatherers in the Namibian deserts, in the Amazon rainforest, because they're in the business of survival. That's what they do every day. They are absolute masters of survival. They would weather such an incident with very little damage, and it would be they and their descendants who would carry forward the human story. And I like to imagine how it might be told 12,000 years from now, how there might be a myth that the archaeologists of that time would dismiss as complete nonsense. How there was a myth that told of a time when there was an advanced civilization on this planet. They were so advanced, they were almost gods. They had supernatural powers. You know, they could look at a little device and speak to one another, even see one another on opposite sides of the planet. They could fly around the earth. They could send people to the moon. But they became corrupt. They became cruel. They became conceited and big-headed. They ceased to wear their prosperity with moderation. They imposed their powers on other less powerful people around the world. And the universe wouldn't put up with that. The universe struck them down. It's our choice. Let's make sure we're not the next lost civilization.
Yep.